Page 10, planning oral assessments. I do want to emphasize that although this says planning, this is not the nitty gritty. This is sort of the why behind the way that we will plan these. So bear with me. Page 10, here we go.
Planning oral assessment, 6 dimensions. Each form of oral assessment has its own unique qualities. However, whatever form the assessment takes, 6 dimensions of oral assessment can be used to guide the planning of new assessment tasks, to review and improve existing assessments, and to promote discussion within teaching teams about the critical features of the assessments they are designing. Dimension 1, what is being assessed? Do we want to assess what a student knows? Do we need to move beyond that to see what a student is able to do? Do we want to see what they can do in the context of their chosen field? Deciding on exactly what is to be assessed is usually the best first step in planning oral assessment. The focus of oral assessment typically includes one or more of the following.
I'm going to pause here and I'm just going to talk you through these real quick. Concepts, theories, and procedures often falls into criterion A for us, and then applied problem solving and integrated practice a lot of times fall into B, C, or D within the IB. Feel free to pause and read these. I will say interpersonal competence and intrapersonal qualities, these are more like ATLs, so we wouldn't necessarily assess these. There may come a day when we emphasize ATLs more heavily, and in that case, interactive oral assessment can offer us something there too. But as we roll this out, we're going to be living here in concepts, theories, and procedures, applied problem solving, and integrated practice. So before we actually plan an assessment, we got to be very clear on what is being assessed. The second thing we need to be planning is what those interactions are going to look like. So here we go.
Dimension 2, interaction. One of the distinctive features of oral assessment is that it allows for interaction between the examiners and the student, and sometimes others, with the interaction often being rapid and unpredictable. Of course, interaction is not essential. A paper can be presented orally with little or no interruption or even discussion following it. And even where interaction does occur, marks may be awarded purely on the basis of the presentation itself. But oral assessment lends itself to interaction, ranging from gentle probing by the examiner seeking further information to the intense interaction of a psychology student with a client or a student arguing with her peers as she tries to convince her fellow students of the worth of the argument she is making. The level of interaction can be located on a continuum, ranging from the non-interactive one-way presentation to the completely dialogic discussion between the student and examiner or student and client, with many points in between, including presentation followed by discussion, question and response followed by probing, or the debate with its presentations, challenges, and final summing up. Interaction can bring assessment to life, and the anticipation of interaction can drive the student to prepare thoroughly for the assessment.
I will say, at this point, they haven't made it super clear. Yes, it is still oral assessment if they're just reading off the paper, but it is not interactive oral assessment. If we are not interacting with a student, we probably should not be grading them, because if we are grading them, we're just grading their ability to read out loud or to repeat what they've memorized. So interaction is the key here to interactive oral assessment. Keep that in mind as we continue listening.
At the same time, however, the path of the assessment can become uncertain, so it is important to make sure that all students are treated fairly, given equal opportunities to display their knowledge. When interaction should be planned. For example, follow-up questions that probe a student's understanding should be worked out in advance. What kinds of interaction will be needed? How will the examiners interact with the student? What if the student has an audience, for example, of fellow students, how will he or she be expected to interact with them? And what role will the audience be asked to play? Dimension 3, authenticity.
Before we listen to authenticity, I want to focus on this again. We don't want secrecy to be what we're doing here. It's fine if the students know what kind of interactions to expect ahead of time. As long as those interactions are planned by you and their intended result is reflected in your rubric, we can do a lot to avoid treating students unfairly. So here we go, Dimension 3, authenticity. As we're planning, we want to make sure that the interactive oral assessments we're planning are not inauthentic. They should be things that are tied to the discipline or the course or the content involved.
Dimension 3, authenticity. Authenticity here refers to the extent to which the assessment replicates real life or what happens in the world of practice. The assessment may involve the use of an actual audience, realistic timeframes for preparation, collaboration between students, and tasks that are multidimensional and located in complex, realistic contexts. Case studies that culminate in oral presentations to a mock panel, role plays, and simulated interviews represent common attempts to incorporate the conditions of practice within the classroom.
I will say it doesn't need to be quite this involved, but it certainly can be. It would be appropriate as well just to have a list of common questions within the unit that the student needs to explain. For example, if you were in, I think that would be criterion A for most of us, knowing and understanding. I've done one that's just 6 questions. You should be able to explain each of these concepts, and we roll a dice to figure it out. So certainly authenticity can be this extreme, but it can also just be that the question itself is an authentic thing that they may need to explain if they head into a career in this area. So last one, structure. Keep this in mind. Structure over secrecy. We are not trying to trick them. So here we go.
Dimension 4, structure. Structure is concerned with how far the assessment follows a predetermined set of questions or sequence of events. Students need a more or less predictable structure to allow them to plan for the assessment and to reduce unnecessary anxiety about unknowns, while a high degree of structure can also increase the reliability of the assessment. However, if the assessment is overly structured, the capacity to ask probing follow-up questions can be lost, as can the possibility of unpredictable questions from fellow students, both of which can cause students to seek deep understanding of what is being assessed. What sort and amount of structure is needed? What aspects of the assessment need to be highly structured? What aspects of the assessment should be more open?
So these are some things we're going to consider as we build these assessments.
Dimension 5, who assesses? Oral assessment lends itself to many possibilities regarding who is involved in the assessor role. In the UK Centre for Events Management,
So I've blacked out a couple things here because there are just a couple that would be inappropriate for us to use as assessors. For example, we're probably not going to bring in members of the community because we would have to teach them how to assess according to IB criteria. It would be a nightmare. Keep in mind, you are the person assessing, but peer feedback is certainly an option, and self-feedback or self-evaluation is also an option here. So although you are the person grading, the feedback can come from you, it can come from peers, and it can come from the student themselves. So here's an example.
In the UK Centre for Events Management, Leeds Metropolitan University, tutors often invite industrialists to hear student presentations, or the tutors themselves take on the roles of representatives of the media.
So this is an example of what we're not going to do. We're not going to invite other people in, and we're not going to have students assessing. This might be appropriate in college, but certainly not here and in our very unique IB context. So final dimension 6, consider as we build interactive oral assessments, are they only oral, or is oral just part of the assessment?
Dimension 6, purely oral or a combination of modes. Learning to evaluate the quality of one assessment can be...
That's right. I need to read this part aloud because the PDF's all over the place. So an assessment can be purely oral, for example, a clinical examination in nursing, or the oral can be combined with other modes, for example, the oral presentation of a written paper or the verbal explanation of a design. It is worth noting that when a written paper is simply read to a group or when a presentation is unduly dependent on PowerPoint slides, the oral nature of the assessment is called into question, and some of the benefits of oral assessment can be lost. So what I'm thinking here is maybe the students write one of the strands within the criteria I'm assessing, because writing is really a better way to capture it. But maybe then, to assess a second strand, they answer questions to me based on the writing. Or maybe they write it and then I grade in a feedback conference, which is itself maybe a little bit more oral. So we've got some options here. We'll talk more about them when we dig into planning. Next up is validity. How valid is the assessment as a way of measuring a student's mastery of something? So here we go.
Assessment is valid when it allows students to fully demonstrate their knowledge, skills, and values in relation to the course they are studying. This includes fundamental qualities of their chosen discipline or profession that may lie behind the specific outcomes for an individual course. There are several kinds of validity that can throw light on the quality of oral assessment. Each provides an important check for the assessment we are designing or seeking to improve, on the face of it. Face validity refers simply to whether the assessment on the face of it seems likely to test what it is supposed to test. If your colleagues or even your students have doubts about this, you need to carefully review the assessment. covering the field. Content validity is about how well the assessment covers the field being studied. Do the questions asked or the presentations required provide a good representation of the course content? Is the assessment sufficiently comprehensive, or are important topics not represented? Equally important, does the assessment include matters that are not part of the course or have not been taught?
That would be a big problem, obviously. Now, this next part of validity, construct validity, this is like graduate level education here. If you want to read it and dig in deep, please do. But the only one we're truly concerned about here in this sort of deeper, detailed more look is how we compare it to other assessments.
Concurrent validity concerns how students' performance on one assessment task correlates with their performance on other tasks designed to test the same or similar learning outcomes. In practice, we rarely test the same learning outcomes in more than one way. However, we should note whether students' performances in oral assessment are noticeably different from their performance in written assessment, and think carefully about why this is occurring. It is likely to indicate something of concern in one or both of the assessments.
So something of concern might be dyslexia, for example, or it might be that one of the assessments is confusing and needs to be rewritten. Or it might be that one of the assessment types they're just not as prepared for. Maybe they're not great speakers or great writers. So if we see that they're doing really well in IOAs and really poorly in written assessment, it's worth having a conversation with one of our student support staff just to make sure that we are supporting them in every way we can. And when we say compared to other assessments, we don't need to be comparing strand A3 on this particular content to strand A3 on the same content again. Obviously, we won't be doing any of that. This is more just IOAs to written, things like that. So last little bit of validity here.
These aspects of validity in oral assessment tell us about how well the assessment has been designed to test what it needs to test. There are two other aspects of validity that are at least as important. They are about the consequences of the assessment. What effect does the assessment have on students' learning? If the assessment involves interaction, probing, and responding to complex tasks, it is likely to encourage students to adopt a deep approach to learning and to be thoroughly prepared. How will the results of the assessment be used? In particular, what are interested parties likely to infer from the results, and how valid will these inferences be?
So next we're going to talk about reliability. This is an important piece of designing strong assessments, but there are some things that we're going to need to consider in our IB context and in our secondary school context.
When a student has completed an oral assessment, can we be confident that he or she would do equally well if they were asked other questions, given a different scenario to respond to, assessed by another colleague, assessed at another time? Reliability is concerned with how dependent students' results are on what case or scenario they are given inter-case reliability, what specific questions, including follow-up questions, they are asked, inter-item consistency, who examines them, inter-rater reliability, and how an examiner's judgments might change over the course of assessing many students' intra-rater reliability.
So I want to pause here. This is, again, graduate level assessment building. We are never going to hit 100% reliability. The goal is not perfection, but just some basic checks and balances to make sure that the assessments we're building are reasonably reliable. So here we go.
Problems in any of these areas lead to errors in judging students' abilities. Fortunately, there are a number of steps that can be taken to increase the reliability of oral assessments. If the assessment can only be based on a single case or scenario, try to ensure that the case or scenario is as representative of the field as possible. Reliability is usually significantly increased if students are assessed on several cases. Where the assessment is based on questioning, increasing the number of questions asked is likely to increase reliability. When panels are often used to increase reliability.
So I'm going to pause right there. We're not going to ask a bunch of different questions, and we're not going to include a panel. These are not areas where we can improve reliability within the MYP context. However, these last two are going to be huge for reliability.
Rubric or marking guide with explicit criteria and standards will be helpful in any situation. Model answers may also be useful in developing a common understanding of criteria and standards across markers.
So the next thing to consider is fairness.
Fairness means that students who are equally knowledgeable should do equally well in an assessment. Fairness entails both an absence of bias and an equal opportunity for all students to develop and demonstrate their ability.
So here, I'm starting to think like, wait a minute, what about my students that are really good public speakers or really good writers? There is, just in choosing a mode of assessment, an inherent unfairness, and that's okay. We're talking about fairness beyond developed abilities in speaking or writing, the actual mode of the assessment. This is more about how the assessment itself is built.
Bias can occur when obviously irrelevant factors such as gender, age, ethnicity, educational background, or class consciously or subconsciously affect an examiner's judgment. Bias can arise in two other ways: when questions or cases unnecessarily favor one group of students over another.
In our context, that might look like cases or questions that are about one particular social understanding or something like that. This next example is about international students, but a good example for the MYP might be a question about going to, say, the supermarket, or a question about going to the movies. If a student doesn't regularly accompany their parents to the supermarket or to the movies, it might favor one group of students over another. So just keep in mind, the best way to figure that out is to have someone review your assessment.
To guard against this, it is advisable to have at least two colleagues from different backgrounds review the assessment cases or questions. When a group of students responds to the assessment in ways that could not be anticipated, indicating that the oral response format posed difficulties for that group, but not others. This type of unfairness may arise when students are being assessed in other than their first language, if the level of language required by the assessment is higher than that required by the course itself or by the context of the student's future work. I use a lot of oral assessment in the form of individual vivas. In some modules, this is what I use for the reassessment of those who have failed, but in others, it is the only mode of assessment. For me, and I believe for our students, the biggest advantage is that we can draw out what they know by asking for further explanation or probing a little further. I would argue that although some students may initially find the prospect of face-to-face assessment a little daunting, it is by far the fairest assessment method in that it is so much easier to differentiate, to allow those who have a good grasp of the subject to really shine by answering complex questions, and those who struggle to be coaxed into at least revealing what they understand. There is much less risk that students will not understand what they're being asked to do in the assessment.
In the case of formatives as well, one of the ways we can deal with something feeling unfair is by offering the student a second opportunity, maybe to answer a second question during IEP. Another thing I really like IOAs for is if a student has missed the assessment, maybe they come in IEP and they're, or if they need to retake an assessment, just because the first assessment was written doesn't mean the retake needs to be, or the makeup needs to be. Maybe they just discuss the assessment with you in IEP, you grade it on the spot, and you move on with your life. These are options, not necessarily things we have to do. Now we move on to marking and grading. This is why we are doing this training. Here we go.
Marking and grading. Criteria and rubrics.
So one of the advantages of oral assessment is that it can be marked quickly and on the spot. To support this, the use of a marking guide or rubric of some sort is usually essential. The use of rubrics in oral assessments has many benefits.
Provides assessors with a common reference point for their judgments. It reduces the likelihood that judgments will be based on extraneous factors. Providing students with the marking guide in advance helps them understand the nature of good work and helps them to evaluate the quality of their own work in the assessment. It provides a basis for peer evaluation feedback when it makes marking more efficient. It provides a useful framework for feedback to students.
So in developing these criteria and rubrics, it is important to be careful about the place of presentation skills per se, and to focus on the assessment of what has been taught in the intended learning outcomes of the course. In IB, this is easy to do. We just focus on our criteria rather than thinking about how eloquently they showed mastery. It's just to what extent did they show mastery? Was it foundational? Was it comprehensive? Was it sophisticated? Based on those individual strands within the criteria. As we mark and grade, they're going to talk a little bit about taking notes. I do like to have a copy of the rubric in front of me, and I can just kind of make little checks on it whenever they accomplish a certain chunk of the rubric. And I can do that just as they're speaking, as long as I'm familiar with the rubric. Regardless of whether or not you do that, though, we are going to make audio recordings of our first round of IOAs just to make sure that we are grading these well. I've talked about this before, but making sure that we roll this out in a way that leaves our population confident in this is the way that we can avoid unnecessary pushback just because IOA is new. Interactive oral assessments, I think, are going to save us a lot of time long term, but in the short term, yeah, we're going to have to be very careful that we roll this out well. Here's an interesting note that we have to consider carefully.
One study of decision making in postgraduate medical education highlighted examiners' tendencies to form an early impression of the candidate and then use the subsequent questions and responses to confirm or disconfirm this impression.
So if your early impression is based on a bunch of stuttering, this can be a problem. Or if your early impression is based on a sentence that the student memorized and it made them sound very knowledgeable, this can be a problem. So as I grade, this is one of the reasons I have the rubric in front of me and I like to make little marks on it, is it puts me in a mindset of like, okay, I'm continually listening, I'm continually seeing what you can do, and then I hold off circling a grade and giving feedback until the end. Obviously, you hold off on feedback until the end, but I hold off even on deciding the grade until they're totally done speaking. So here we go. We're getting to the end now. We are preparing students for oral assessment. This prep is maybe the most important thing we can do as we get them ready.
Students will have had varying experiences of oral assessment at school or on previous courses. These are likely to have informed their expectations about oral assessment and how they should prepare. The oral assessment that they're about to undergo may be quite different. Students need to learn about forms of assessment just as they learn about other things. Rarely is it enough simply to tell students in writing or verbally in class what is required. Seeing examples of assessment, either live or on video, having opportunities to discuss expectations, and having opportunities to practice the assessment format before it is used for formal purposes are all important ways of preparing for oral assessment.
So this might look like us practicing together in class, sort of like an I answer one so you can see how it works. Maybe I ask another question and let someone from the class volunteer. Then maybe each person practices answering one to their partner. It's also a great reason to build a bunch of think, pair, shares into your lessons, or that frequent small group purposeful talk, because even though they're just talking with their neighbor about the learning, they are practicing for oral assessment.
Some suggestions for preparing students. Several steps can be taken to help familiarize students with the oral assessment format and requirements, and find out what previous experiences of oral assessment your students have had as a basis for comparing and contrasting your assessment. 1, provide clear written information about the assessment and spend time discussing this in class, and provide opportunities for practice in class time. For example, if the assessment is based on group presentations, build short presentation activities with time for discussion and feedback into regular class time. If the assessment is carried out in front of peers, use peer. Conclusion. Evaluation and feedback to help students become familiar with criteria and standards. Take time to debrief students following the assessment. Verbal feedback and the opportunity to discuss what went well and where improvement could be made will help students in similar future assessments.
And I'll say, we're calling these feedback conferences. This is such a great way to give your students immediate feedback, and it takes the time spent later grading and marking up their papers off of you. So this is definitely something we want to learn to do well.
Students are often not experienced in expressing themselves orally within their chosen discipline. Build in opportunities for speaking in class in different informal and semi-formal ways. Use in-class strategies that require all students to speak frequently, including short talks.
All right, here we are, the home stretch.
Conclusion. Assessment is at the heart of learning, and decisions about the modes and methods of assessment can exercise a profound influence on students' experience, how they perceive their courses, how they relate to each other and to their teachers, and how they prepare for the world of practice beyond the university. Teaching, learning, and assessment processes that strengthen students' engagement with ideas, that develop identity, and that build relationships within communities of learning depend on multiple modes of communication. In an age of mass higher education, the continuing and expanding use of oral assessment as part of a carefully designed mix of assessment types provides rich opportunities for student engagement, as well as opportunities for enhanced judgments about student achievement. While oral assessment raises many challenges, it also offers considerable rewards for teachers and students alike. It is hoped that the ideas and examples presented in this guide will encourage you to continue and even extend your use of oral assessment, or to begin using oral assessment if you aren't already doing so. Hopefully, the guide will also help promote discussion with fellow teachers and students about how to develop this critical aspect of our role as educators. What is oral assessment?
Nope, we've
Oral
already done
assessment.
this. Thank you for listening.